Tu podcast w głowie się mieści. Okay, so thank you, Matthieu, that you agreed to be, a guest on my podcast, Wrap Up Your Head podcast. My today guest, Matthieu Villatte. He is a PhD. He is the assistant professor of Baxter University in Seattle, in Washington, in the United States. Yeah, you obtained your degree in psychology in France, where you are also you are an author of one of the first ACT books and the manuals to do acceptance and commitment therapy in France, as I find out. Also, you moved to the University of Nevada in Reno when you were on the membership of the Stephen Hayes, PhD, and you worked there as the assistant professor in clinical psychology at the University of Louisiana. And at the Evidence-Based Practice Institute of Seattle for several years. And then you joined the Baxter University as an assistant professor in 2018. Am I right, or I mixed up everything?
Yeah, that's correct. At UNR in Nevada, when I joined Steve Hayes University, it was as a postdoc. So I did a year and a half there. I actually worked under grants. It's like the funding for research, and it was research led by his wife, Jackie Pistorello. So technically, I was working with her, but I also spent a lot of time in Steve's lab for about a year and a half, and I taught at that university. That was my first experience in the US when I moved almost 13 years ago now. Yeah.
Oh, so it's a pretty long time now. You lived in the US and work. Yeah.
Time flies. Yeah.
Yeah. You are also an author of a lot of books and chapters on mindfulness, on ACT, yes, and you are also the co-author of the one of first time I have a contact with you as a person, so it was by a book, a great one, the Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. Yeah, so you are a co-author with Jennifer Villatte, and with Professor Stephen Hayes, and it's about the book is about the topic of our today podcast, about the language and the RFT, and I highly recommend this book, and I can't wait to see it in Poland to be published, as you probably know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's been translated now into several languages. I actually participated actively in the translation into French, because I wrote it in English, even though I'm French, and plus we wrote together. I wrote all the drafts in English, and then Jen and Steve chimed in. Then there's a lot of modifications and things like that. But then translating into French was a long process. Several people who participated translated a chapter, and then I coordinated everything so that to make sure that everything would be smooth and coherent. It's translation is never easy, of course, but when it's a book about language, you also want it to be really written and well translated, because then RFT for a long time has had a reputation of being difficult. So if on top of that, the people who talk about it, or the writing needs to be as clear as possible, as engaging as possible, and that can be lost in the translation. So it's a bit of work, but yeah, I hope that it will be translated into Polish at some point. It'd be great.
Yeah. And this book is being now translated to French, yeah, and
it's published now already. It's
published,
been for about 3 years now in French. It's been translated and published also in Spanish, in Italian, in German, and it's in the process in Russian, Korean. It's also been translated into Farsi, but I don't think it's an official publication. Yeah. So yeah, it seems to. And I know that there are people interested in Japan also in doing it. So progressively, people are working on it. Yeah.
Great. So I hope that this will be published in Poland too.
Yeah.
And on the beginning, would you say something about your path, about your way that brings you like to the ACT, to the contextual behavioral science, like your beginnings, backgrounds?
Yeah. Well, I think the beginning, I would start it with discovering behaviorism, behavior analysis. So I was, as a student in psychology in France, in my very first year as we'll call freshman in the US, when I was 18. So I chose psychology. It's not exactly like in the US. I don't know how it is in Poland, but it's sort of a major, but it's more than that even, because in the US, when you choose a major in a field like psychology, you have a lot of hours in that domain, but you still have a lot of hours in other disciplines. And then progressively you become more and more specialized. But in France, when you leave high school, if you go to the university, you choose a track, you choose really the domain that you're going to study. And it's the only thing that you study. There's a couple of hours in sociology, philosophy, things like that. But really, it's mostly what I would study was psychology from the start, which is a little particular, given that it's not something that we study in high school. So I chose psychology. It was going to be everything I was going to study, and yet I had never studied it before. The only thing that was sort of close to that was philosophy in high school, which I studied quite a lot. But it's not exactly the same, obviously. So I picked psychology because I was interested, really, mostly. I didn't have a career path in mind. I want to be a psychologist. I want to be a clinician. I was interested in everything potentially, but really mostly I was interested in understanding human behavior. I would not have said it exactly like that at that time, but that's it. That's understanding how people function, and I was curious about it. It was not to solve personal issues and things like that. It was not that. I mean, along the way, I've learned a lot of things about myself, of course, but that was not the goal either.
The dominant,
No, and it's not, and it was not because I was interested in clinical psychology in particular either. It was not like I want to help people who suffer from psychological issues. It's not. I didn't have a particular project, and I say all this because I think that's contributed to then getting into this whole field and doing what I did on RFT for clinical work. I think I've always had an open mind, but also really driven by curiosity and passion. If I find something that interests me, I can really focus on it and work a lot on it and be thorough. But if I'm not interested, I'm not going to last very long in what I'm doing. And so in some ways, when I look back at everything I did, it could look like it was very coherent and planned. So getting to behaviorism and then doing a research on behavior analysis, to studying the concept of theory of mind, which is a a whole topic of research for many years now about, basically it's about how people can attribute mental states to others and to themselves. It's a topic that's been studied a lot in schizophrenia, in autism and all. And so I wanted to explore that from a behavior analysis perspective when I started my PhD, my dissertation, and I was looking for things that had been done maybe on this topic, because there was a topic that was really much more from cognitive psychology. Yeah. And that's how I found RFT, and then got into RFT, then I discovered ACT, and then so on. But I go back just a moment to my first year. It happened that my first course, really first lecture, was with the teacher who became later my supervisor for my PhD. And he was a behaviorist. He's still alive, but he's retired now for about 10 years. Steph Fresha. He was a Spanish teacher, but who had moved to France for a long time. When I met him, he was a professor in France. I think, if I remember well, he finished his studies in France, but he started in Spain. I might be wrong about that. But he had been in France for a long time. And he was the only behaviorist in France. It's not completely true. At that point, there were a few more, but many of them were his former students. When he moved to France, if I'm correct, there was no behaviorist. Certainly not like true Skinnerian trained in behaviorism from the start. There are people who were getting into behavioral psychology, behavioral therapy, and all, because the field was developing. But at the university, there were very, very few first universities. There was, I think, 2 universities at that time, Amiens and Lille, where they were behaviorists, and very few behaviorists. In my university, there were only 2, my teacher and one of his, I think that was a former student of his. And it was just coincidence. It's not, I didn't pick that place. It was just my hometown. I went to Amiens, my hometown, for university. That's what most people do in France, because universities are relatively equal in quality across the territory. So it's not like UK or US where you want to go to the best school. That can happen, but mostly it's relatively
on the same level.
Relatively, at least that was the case 25 years ago. And I just happened to be a behaviorist. So that's interesting, because it was coincidence in a way. That being said, I got interested in behaviorism very quickly. The first courses were not explicitly about behaviorism, but already I could sense, could understand. And I could go on and on just on that first year, so I'll be short. But I think I started to really learn already that mentality of being functional and contextual. The terms were used, but it was not functional contextualism. But really, that's what it was. Basically, what I understood at that time is that we were doing a kind of psychology that was not just about explaining, understanding, describing, but really about what can we do with it. Functional. That's very, very important. And so that means that theories, ideas get to be tested in the end.
Experiential way.
Yeah, in terms of what you can do with it, not just tested through experiments and research, of course, but also in the end, what are you going to do with that? And my teacher, Esther Fresha, was very good at giving examples that were concrete from real life, everyday life, and also applied to society, politics, and things like that. So right from the start, I had this sense that behavioral psychology is really interesting.
Concrete,
It's concrete, but it can also be very, very a big, abstract, fascinating. It's not just solving little problems. That's what often is misunderstood about behavioral psychology. It's that we're going to be very mechanistic, and we're going to train rats, we're going to fix symptoms. But it can be really much more even spiritual than that. So then progressively, when I discovered RFT and ACT, as I was saying, which was not at all something that my supervisor knew directly, but he let me work with the RFT approach because why not? He was open to that. But that means that I sort of taught myself reading books, articles. And then fortunately, the ACBS community was already at the time very, very inclusive, active. It was so easy. You contact, I remember the first time I sent an email to Steve Hayes, a Saturday afternoon, and he answered to me a couple of hours later, maybe a few minutes later. And I heard that story many times from other people, the same exact thing. I think he does that more with new people than with people that for a long time. That makes sense. But regardless of his motivation, that had a big impact, because I really felt like, wow, this is a place where you can, you can be in contact with a lot of people. They're going to be helpful. They welcome
values,
exactly,
in an act way,
exactly.
You can do and create the things that you want.
Yes. There was no test of knowledge, or there is no like a certificate prove who you are. No, when I contacted him, we had started a little website with a friend and colleague who actually supervised me for my clinical training, Jean-Louis Menestes, who wrote a lot of great books in France. And we were just playing a bit with ACT, learning ACT by ourselves mostly. And we had created a little website. It was called the magazine ACT. And so we would write very short, almost blogs really, on ACT. And I contacted Steve to let him know about it, and it was very welcoming. It was great. Gave us some advice on how to create a community in France and things like that. It was not like, okay, who are these guys? Do they really know ACT? Do they know RFT? Are they certified? Have they been to
Dr. Google?
No, I mean he did actually Google us. I know that because I think so, because he mentioned. I remember that. He said, I think we were not members of ACBS at that time, and not yet, I suppose. And so I looked, but I didn't find you. So he encouraged us to join. Well, it hasn't changed in that way. He's always interested in growing the membership. But, in the end, it was like the doors were open. And 6 months later, I was at my first conference in Holland in 2009, and I was presenting. And then things went really fast in many ways. It's something that I would say is an interesting fact about the community of ACBS, is that there is a good match between the principles that are being researched, are being applied in therapy, and the concepts, and how the organization functions too. For the most part, of course, it has gone so much bigger over time that certainly we can point at a lot of flaws, and I'm not the last doing it. I've been part of the ACBS board. There was a whole period of time when I was very active in the community, and also I knew well how it functioned. And there are definitely a lot of criticisms that we can formulate about this community, the association, and all. However, there is something really admirable about the way the people who funding this association and then contributed to the development really try to match the values, but not just the values in terms of the goals, alleviating human suffering and things like that, but also how we're going to do it. When you take the concept of self as context, for example, in ACT, and maybe I can say really quickly what it consists of if people don't know it very, very quickly. Basically an idea of approaching oneself as, on one hand, something very large. I can include great numbers of identities and experiences and roles and actions. So I can sort of watch all these things that I can do. So that allows me to have then a lot of possibilities in terms of what I do at any moment. It's very similar to the concept of values. On one hand, you have a concept, compassion, and then you have all the actions, the goals, the ways that you can be compassionate. So self as context, same idea. You have a sense of self that's very abstract, conceptual, very simple in a way, but then inside of it, it can be very complex. So the idea of the association, I think the community is very similar in that way. It's like on one level, it's okay. We have one goal, alleviating human suffering and things. And then we can allow for a lot of people to come in and do it. Now, of course, in many ways, you could say, well, that's the case for any organization, any association, of course. But I think what was particularly successful in the CBS community has been, I think, probably still is that it's less, I don't think we can say not, but less hierarchical, at least less linear. Of course, you can see Steve Hayes at the top of it in many ways, of course. And then other people around him, you know, and then, okay, it's true. And again, that's things that we can criticize. But you can also see a lot of mutual influence. I came from nowhere, really, a lab in Amiens. I'm sure Steve has never heard of the city. And then, you know, there's nothing exceptional about my particular journey. I think there are other people who've done things like that too, and other people could have done it. But I was interested. I had something to contribute to. And then instead of being received with skepticism or doubts, or you need to go through this training and this training first.
First of all, to do a certificate or something.
It's like
so they are open.
Do it, like, contribute.
Like the processes of ACT, like the same, which is my experience, that like that you do. Like the people from the ACBS on the conferences, they have like the special part when it calls Fullies or something like that. Yeah. So
it's a concept that was started in in the Association for Behavior Analysis, from what I heard actually, and that's Steve Hayes, Kate Wilson, they imported to ACBS. The idea that you can challenge the leaders, the gurus, you can make fun of them. It's, you know, it existed in societies for millennials. It's a way of bringing people back down to earth, you know, finding humility again, and giving more voice to people who might be at the bottom of the hierarchy. But if you can do that on a more almost everyday basis, at least on an ongoing process, then you get a system that's it's not just like linear, and here are the bosses that once a year gets to be made fun of. The idea is that it's continuously like that. You should at least try to be like that.
You are afraid after it, you know.
Exactly. No, it's I mean, again, it's not perfect, and there can be conflicts and everything. And actually, conflicts are not necessarily a sign of problems. It's more like how you resolve them, and you can look at how they are resolved over time too. You know, sometimes a conflict needs a year to be resolved. So if you look at for a month, you can think that it's a failure, but then you can look over time and say, actually, we learned something from it. So anyways, that's something that I've benefited from, the spirit in CBS, and then contributed to. And what I did, and then I guess we'll talk about it next, is what I did in the domain of RFT for clinicians, to me, is a reflection of that whole idea. Really.
Right. Yeah, and like the part of the title of your book is language as an intervention. And I'm wondering how we can understand it. Like in which levels, which ways the language can be an intervention. It's pretty interesting, I think.
I think to answer this question, giving a bit of context on how the idea of the book came about, I think can help. Originally, what happened is that when I joined the CBS community actively around 2009, 2010, so I had just done my PhD with a focus on RFT. I was an RFT guy, you know, and I was ACT too, because I was starting to do ACT trainings as a trainer in France. And like I said earlier, we were almost teaching ourselves, but starting to learn by teaching it, really. But for me, that meant that ACT and RFT were really tightly connected. And I really had that idea that based on what I had read too, but also from my own journey to ACT, that RFT came first. It's like there's RFT and then ACT is an application. And RFT is a theory of language and cognition. ACT is therapy.
Therapy, how to use it,
exactly. But at that time, what was more common, it seemed, in the community at large, is that you don't need to know RFT, or you can know a little bit of RFT to do ACT. I think the separation between ACT and RFT were starting to grow at that time, or had reached a certain point of separation where you had more and more people who were doing ACT had never really learned RFT, and the original people who had been in these both communities from the beginning, well, there were fewer, at least in proportion, in the community. And so, coming from my perspective, I felt really attached and interested in the idea of to make these connections more clear, but also more useful. We go back to what I was saying earlier. I was not really too excited if people would just say, "Oh, it's interesting. RFT is interesting." I mean, it's great to be interesting, but if you teach in a training, a clinical workshop for therapists, you want them to tell you that they are going to apply something in what they learn, right? That they find interesting, absolutely, but also useful. They see what they can do with it. And so I started to almost like want to prove a point, because I could see it, but it was really questioned at that time. And I would say even the big leaders like Steve and Kelly Wilson and all, they were not very, they probably would deny it now, but I don't know, maybe not. But I can show the emails from the listserv and things like that. They were not very strong at defending RFT for clinicians. I think they were afraid that they would scare clinicians and all. They had experienced it probably. But so the thing is, and I'm going to your question about language intervention, is that there is really this idea of ACT is the therapy approach, RFT is the model of language. Okay. And usually the way we would bring RFT into ACT was, and you can still see it in first chapters of books or in slides of workshops from that time, it was more to explain psychopathology, saying language is the cause of suffering. And you see it in the books.
Yeah, like it's in the classical cognitive behavioral therapy where you have the negative automatic thoughts that they causes some the anxiety, the change of the mood or something.
And then you're starting to see it also in this whole third wave with mindfulness and all, where the idea that basically you're the analytic mind, you're thinking or disconnecting from the present moment was the cause of suffering. Like you're in the future, you're anxious, you're in the past, you're depressed, or you're into your obsessive thoughts, and you're stuck in problem-solving mode and rumination. There's a lot of understanding of psychopathology that was from that perspective that the mind works well, but there are areas where it causes problems. That's the idea with Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life, the book. It's like, okay, you need to go back to your direct experience, because your mind, your language, your thoughts, your rules are getting you stuck. It's taking you away from what you care about, from your experience, for your emotions. That was really the lingo of ACT and the whole third wave in a nutshell. So RFT was used to sort of prove that point from a behavioral analytic perspective, saying, okay, this is what happens with language. You can make symbolic connections between things, and then if you try to avoid thinking of trauma, for example, the problem is there's going to be connections, and then even when you look at the window, it's going to remind you of the trauma, and then you look at your cat and it reminds you of a trauma, and then you watch TV, because constantly there's a spread of connections. And then there was also all the work on rules and insensitivity to your experience. When you follow rules, you learn fast, but the problem is then you don't learn enough from your concrete experience, and then when things change, or when what you're doing, when you're following the rules doesn't work anymore, then you don't see that it's not working, right? It's often like the metaphor of the GPS. You follow your GPS, like you would follow your mind with the rules and all, but you don't see that you're about to hit a wall. So that was the lingo, explaining the problem, but not so much explaining or guiding, even better, the work, the clinical work in ACT. Well, usually what would happen is that then after you have understood how the problem happens with language from an RFT perspective, you would switch to ACT. And then RFT is gone at that point. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to do diffusion, we're going to do values, we're going to do mindfulness. And then you don't hear about RFT anymore. I'm talking at that time, at the 10, 15 years ago, not today, but that time, really, there was very little RFT once you started to talk about that. And so what I wanted to do with the book, and I say I, because that was really what I wanted to do. And then Jen and Steve joined the project, but I was, there are things I have no problem saying I was not a leader. It was the idea of somebody else. But in that case, I say it also as a way of saying, well, if I'm wrong, you can call me out too, because that's what I wanted to do. That's also a way of taking responsibility when I say I. Then the idea at first was like, we need to do, I want to do an ACT book that's really grounded in RFT, showing how ACT works from an RFT perspective. But eventually what happened is that the more, and now I'm saying we, because that became really collective work, the more we dove into RFT, understanding clinical work, not just psychopathology, but intervention and how we help people from an RFT perspective. And the more it felt like it's about language in general, how we use language. So you see the switch from the past lingo, it's language causes problem. We need to get back to experience. The more we studied RFT, and the more we realized that, well, it's not like language gets on the side. It's that how do we use language to solve the problems caused by language in a way that's functional, contextual, in a way that is. So it was partly ACT, but then it became broader. It became like, okay, well, how do people in motivational interviewing do it? How do people in psychodynamic therapy do it? How do people with cognitive therapy do it? Because they all use language as an intervention.
Yeah, so it starts to be pretty complex, and like I understand that from different dimensions, you start to check how we can influence, first of all, understand, and then how we can shape, for example, a behavior by language.
Yeah, because the thing is, you're going to do it no matter what, right? There's no psychotherapy that doesn't use language. Even therapies that emphasize the connection when you're with the body, for example, or mindfulness-based therapy that are going to emphasize the contact with present moments and physical sensations. At the very minimum, you could say, well, there's still instructions, like focus on your breath, focus on the present. But then it's more than that. It's like, well, when you notice your thoughts, when you label your thoughts, as emotions, from an RFT perspective, it's a lot of language that you're doing. Categorizing experiences as thoughts, as emotions, noticing judgments. It's very, very analytic, very abstract process that you cannot do with language. And it's not a side point, it's central. I think the more we think that when we do mindfulness, experiential work, we are moving away from language, the more we can cause problems, actually. Because then we start to create fragmentation in our clients and in ourselves. Because we start basically, well, more than fragmentation, it's like an autoimmune system that's dysregulated. It's like you start fighting things that don't have to be fought. It's like, just like when we say experiential avoidance, the problem is we start fighting our emotions, but our emotions are not bad. And well, you can do the same thing with your thinking. If you say, get out of your mind and into your life, and you take it literally, then every time you thinking, you're like, oh yeah, I need to get out of my mind. It's my mind shattering. I should not. And I have seen that a lot over the years. This
very
drift.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we are creating new connections that we also start to apply, like without any conscious way,
with a lack of
automatically
or you push yourself to do it and it doesn't work. It's just like avoiding emotions. You're trying and then you can do it. So now I'm not saying that therapies like ACT actively promoted avoidance of thinking or in general, but I think it's and that's obviously something that can be argued about. But my stance is that by liking the connection with RFT, and maybe by building the model from a series of techniques and therapies and traditions that came from different areas, like we know, influenced by even New Age movements in the US, like Est and things like that. Okay, there's lots of interesting ideas in these approaches, why not? But the risk also is to import the way it's conceptualized. When you look at New Age movements from the 70s and 80s, there's a lot of things that sound incredibly similar to ACT, even in the way it's conceptualized. Not just the techniques, but the way it's conceptualized. The whole idea of the mind sharing, you can build your reality and everything. So I think what's useful with RFT is if it succeeds, that's the ambition, is to bring precision and coherence at different levels of analysis. Like you can get from the basic lab research, how language is developed, work, to concepts, surface context, spirituality, values. And at no point there is a rupture in the concepts, in the philosophy, in the way you analyze it. It can become more abstract, simpler. Like I can use values, that's not a problem. Surface context, that's not a problem. Then I will break it down into hierarchical framing, dialectic framing, and then we can break it down to how it's acquired. And then you can go to religious traditions that will never use concept of surface context, but they will talk about transcendence, for example. So, so that, of course, anybody can do that, talk about these things. But what RFT can bring, when it's done well, and I would say more generally functional contextualism, CBS, is this coherence across the levels of analysis. That was the project, when we say that contextual behavioral science is about scope and depth, and precision, scope and depth. It's what I'm saying here. Is you can start with basic principles, even like ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence, and then you add framings. Can be very simple, but then it builds up into very complex phenomenon. And same way with interventions. It can be brief silence in therapy. It can be group therapy. It can be an intervention at the public health level. The idea is that you maintain this coherence across the model.
And from your experience, how maybe like from your clinical practice, how the knowledge about the language or the RFT can like empower, enhance the therapeutic work?
Yeah, there's different ways. So one way is the reading of what's going on. So conceptualization, ongoing conceptualization by listening to what the client is saying or not saying, and paying it. That contributes to this conceptualization. For example, if you can notice how the client is conceptualizing themselves, like how do they think of themselves? Is that so I use a little bit of technical terms, but not too heavily for people to understand, even if they have not read anything of RFT, but to bring also a little bit of to show a little bit what RFT can bring. So for example, if people are talking a lot in terms of coordination between themselves and the concepts, I am a father and a father, and then this concept of father is also with a lot of coordination, and that you sense that there is not a lot of flexibility in this way of speaking, like if you say, if you didn't have kids, what would you do today? Well, I don't know, I'm father, and it's like just going back to that idea, then you sense this coordination is very strong. It doesn't leave a lot of room for other possibilities, options. So that's more on the reading. You can also look at perspective taking in the future, in the past, and things like that, and say, what is the client able to do? Like, can they shift perspective in the future? Can they shift perspective with other people? And when they do it, does that change the way they're looking at things? So that's more in the reading part. Then you can look also at in terms of intervention, what you choose to do. The idea is that you can be more intentional, more precise with your language, but it should not come to the point where you're overthinking what you're doing. or what you're saying. And that's often a concern at first when you learn RFT, is think, oh, but then am I gonna have to know what framing I'm using?
What I should to say.
Yeah, no, it as part of a training, you can do that. That's a possibility. It's an exercise then. Like in my trainings, I show videos of therapy, and I ask participants to spot the types of framing. So is it hierarchical framing? Is it perspective taking here and there and there? But it's an exercise to train yourself to see it, hear it on the fly. But you can always improve. I've improved over the years just by training. And so you get better, you get more fluid, but it's not an end in and of itself. It's more like like reading music or knowing principles of chemistry, all these things. You learn not only what the basic principles are, but you learn to see it, to interact with it in the moment. So that helps you, if you want to analyze it at that level. But you don't have to be constantly thinking at that level. Like think of a physicist, but not a physician, a physicist, or a chemist could know a lot of things about molecules in water or something like that. Do they have to constantly think? No, but they can. And depending on what they want to do, they are able to get at a certain level of analysis. So when I do trainings, sometimes we get at this level of analysis. But then often I say to participants, then just do your job and just don't think about it. I mean, think about it if you think about it. I'm not saying you should not think about it, but don't try necessarily to think, is it framing this? Is it that? Is that? Just you have done some work in training that's going to have an impact on what you're doing now.
Yeah, that you can respond on what you perceived, like what framing you see or experience right now with your client.
Yeah. It's what I'm saying here is something you can find in a lot of disciplines outside of psychology. In sport, for example, it's very common. You see people, they want to improve on a particular move. So I don't know, a tennisman, for example, you want to improve in service. Well, you have to play games, of course, but there are also times to train. And then what you're going to do is you are going to look at the whole movements in details, and then realize you go work with the coach and say you need to take your racket, it's a little more there, and then you move your body, and you can work on lots of details. Then you play your game. And when you play your game, what happens? You don't have to think of these things all the time. You probably should not, because that's probably going to interfere with responding in the moment. But the work that you did before doesn't go away because you don't think about it. And if it starts to go wrong, like your service doesn't work anymore, you know what to do more because you've learned these details. You're like, okay, my service isn't working. What am I not doing? I think I'm a little more like the timing is off, and maybe I'll have to go back to training. But in the moments, even during the game, I'm able to fix that. That's the kind of thing that you can do with RFT. In the moment, in session, things get stuck, and you're like, you can pause, you can look at what's going on, pay attention to, it could be framings, it can be things, and you're like, what is going on? All therapies should have that possibility, of course. It's an ongoing case conceptualization, understanding what's going on, especially therapies that like to work as a process in the moment. Psychodynamic therapies, functional analytic psychotherapy, ACT when it's done like that, because it's not always done in that way also. But again, RFT, what it can bring, I'm not saying that nothing else can bring what RFT does, perhaps not, but what it can bring is that possibility of being very precise with language so that you can gain fluidity, intention, precision. But again, it's not going to make your way of interacting with your client more technical, more complicated. No, in fact, I would say the more I have known RFT and the less technical, complicated, or even talkative I've been in therapy. You just use fewer words with more intention, more impact, more precision. Even a silence acquires new function with that. That's how I like to work with RFT anyways.
Great. So we can like operate with the language like a surgeon a little bit, like to know how we can respond for some kind of like types of language problems. And
you can do it intentionally in the moment. You can also just reflect on what happened. Like it's a level of analysis, and we all humans do that, you know, like come home, say, hi, how are you doing? I'm fine, it was a good day. Are you on an automatic pilot mode function? And I may be fine. Maybe you're just like reading. Do you have to necessarily every moment thinking, what's my intention in saying hello? Do I love my partner? Am I telling the truth when I said I am okay, or am I lying? Right, but that's good to be able to do it though, because imagine you start to not feel very connected to your partner, for example, or with your kids, you're feeling like not disconnected. Then you can analyze it. You're like, okay. Where we don't talk to each other very much anymore. Then you analyze and you're like, I noticed that I'm responding a lot too automatically. What's going on? I realize that I don't talk about how I feel these days, or when I ask, how are you doing? I say yes, but without thinking about it, where's my intention? So you can do that analytic to reflection. Everybody does that. That's part of theory of mind, actually. I was saying that's something I studied, you know. So RFT imagine it's like you have an update on your software, something like that, and it's like, oh, look at what you can be able to do. You get the analytics, of numbers and things like that. But you don't have to be constantly, actively reading or listening like that. I would say for me, it's a bit like, I'm pretty much, I guess, bilingual, French and English. And I think it doesn't really feel like any language is turned off completely ever. I speak right now in English, but I don't feel like French is off. I feel like I could perhaps almost hear it at the same time. And it's I think no, I think it can be a problem. It is a problem so often when we learn at first, because it's an interference. So it's the same thing with RFT. At first it can be like, the framing, but then if you stick with it, it's like you're able to read at the same time, the same level. And it's not interference. It becomes actually a help. It becomes more fluid.
When you want to say something, for example, like doing an interview, and then I have to translate it from Polish to English, and then like to build some connections that maybe they they are somewhere in my mind.
Well, I mean, that's a sign that, I mean, we'll always progress, right? We can always progress. So when we get a bit stuck, wait, that still happens to me, like, what's the right word here? Sometimes I go back to French, or actually to English. I speak to a French person, and then that can happen. But then you can get at levels where, I remember I did a training once in Colombia, and the interpreter was translating simultaneously. We had a little cabin in the back, and it was really very good, very, very good. Perfect in timing, fluid and all. It's perfect. But then I saw at some point he was reading at the same time as it was translating. So at some point I had to ask him and say, why are you reading? He said, oh, I'm reading books on ACT and things like that, so in English, at the same time as he was translating, like not when he had a break, as he was doing it. And he said, actually, oh, it helps me that way. I'm less in my head, and that's the level he was at. So I think with RFT, I think I could fairly say that I'm at that level with RFT. It's like, it's there, it's not there, it's on and off. I can go there, I don't have to. And in a way, flexible, it's accessible. It's like it's like sort of breathing, or can I speak and walk at the same time? Yeah, you can do it too. But it's not, we take things for granted. It's things that we have to learn to. So when you learn RFT, when you want to learn RFT, reading the book or doing trainings and things like that, I mean, when I speak that way, perhaps it's like, so how much do I need to learn to get to that level? I don't know, because it also depends on how you approach it, I think. there are people who come to RFT with a background that makes it really easy, or at least natural, to get into RFT. And then it's a matter of motivation. I think it resonates with you. You get passionate about it, and it's less a matter of how long does it take to get a certain level. What's great about this kind of approach, functional, contextual, is that it's not fixed. Where, okay, I know what it is. I got it. I have the competencies. I've acquired. I have the certification. No, it's more like a martial art or learning music. It's like ask a pianist, like a level they have. Well, they can always improve. You can play that beautiful piece of music, but you can make it better. You can improve the interpretation. You can. So RFT gives you that possibility also, and that's probably one of the best contributions of RFT to clinical practice, is giving you a language, a way of thinking that's going to make your work really always a sort of a curiosity and growth. And again, I don't think it's the only theory, approach, or thing that you can bring to a clinical practice that will add to that. But that's something that RFT can do.
Do you think that we can, for example, assimilate RFT to, for example, schema therapy, like to use it to I don't know. Do you know a schema therapy?
Yeah, I know schema therapy fairly well. I am not specifically trained or used it, but I have a very good friend in Montreal who was an international trainer in schema therapy, and was a long experience in schema therapy. So I learned a lot from him in discussions with him. I think there are similarities in that it gives you a good reading. Especially when it comes to what we often call personality disorders. Instead of precisely calling them disorders, you think more, you can see more the continuity between the functioning of a child and problems that can be already at a time. But it's a fairly, I think, I like the idea that it's, I mean, in a way, yeah, of course, it's a model of psychopathology, maladaptive and all, but it's also very normalizing because it's functional. You understand how it works, why it works. So it's I think it's similar to RFT in that sense. You can read at different levels. Like I talk to somebody and I'm talking to them as an adult, but I can also hear the child, for example. I can see the history playing that. And that's also something that we can forget, right? That's available. Like if I get into an argument with a neighbor because they're making too much noise, maybe at first I will speak myself actually from my 10-year-old self, and they will speak from the. But if I can bring that reading, then that can change something. Maybe I won't see the person as threatening. Maybe I'll realize that I'm being a little bratty, and maybe also I'm in need of something validation. So I think I would agree. I mean, that's the idea of any theory in the end. A good theory, functional theory, conceptualizes your experience, your actions, your behaviors, your intervention, so that you can always have that reading, an explanation, a guidance, regardless of what's happening. You don't get too attached, too stuck with the specifics of a situation. Now, not all theories have the potential of depth and precision and scope as RFT. I think that's the thing that I love about behavioral psychology in comparison to cognitive psychology and other models that I've seen. Often there are different theories and models, and they explain this area, but then if you want to move to another area, it's like a completely different set of concepts. And we see that in psychotherapy too. So, like you need a protocol for that kind of problem, for OCD, and then you need something else. But then look, it's exposure in both cases, or call it something else than exposure if you want. Call it, I don't know,
other type of exposure, like prolonged exposure, or in vivo,
or MDR, or something like that, or a term from psychoanalysis, things like that, free association or whatever. But it's not fundamentally different. And so I like, for the example of schema therapy, I like that it's, if I'm correct, that it can explain any psychopathology from that perspective. So it's actually pretty the good scope and depth and parsimony. I think the advantage of RFT is that it's not a psychotherapy model first. It's a theory of language that we use in ACT, we use in this, when we say clinical RFT, it's not a psychotherapy model. It's more like, how do we think with RFT in psychotherapy practice? When we wrote the book, we tried, even though, of course, we're highly influenced by ACT, given who we were, but and also our original intentions, as I said, but we tried really to think more broadly and say, okay, how could this book be useful to psychoanalysts, to cognitive therapists, to humanistic therapists? And I think it's not just to attract more people or good intention, but for me, over the years, even since the publication of the book, I've just seen that being so true and more true. I see it from people who come to trainings, but also from my own development. I sense that knowing RFT and functional contextualism and thinking from that perspective helps me, like I said about self as context, helps me really have that openness but coherence. I can learn from a lot of tradition, and I don't feel like I'm every time adopting a new completely new paradigm or new way of thinking about psychopathology. If it's the case that those models have a different way, then there are aspects that I can take, but not others. Often it's more a matter of translating what they're saying into my language and completing it. Sometimes it helps me also transform my understanding of RFT. Like an example of that is how over the years I've become really more and more pretty much a fan of Carl Rogers. Really, I love his work, and over time, I found that to me is the best, if I were to say, clinical therapist, clinical RFT therapist. And I like to give the example because he was fairly opposed to behavioral therapy. I mean, don't want to oversimplify it, but in the 60s, 70s is really more like in opposition to the development of behavioral therapy, CBT, and much less evidence-based, even though it did research. It's probably not what was the most impactful in what he did. But in the end, not just what he does, but how he explains what he does, why he does what he does. Like, for example, this whole looking for incongruence and then helping clients really being, so now I'm not going to use his terms, but it's a form of exposure too. It's like getting in touch with the I could say conflict to psychodynamic, like the incongruence. Is there something that feels off? Where the uncomfortable, and we stick with it, right? We stick with it, but with compassion, with presence, acceptance. And then for me, I see hierarchical framing. I see multiple perspective taking. I see perspective taking that are in conflict, don't want to fit together, don't want to coordinate, and so. What we do is like we bring a hierarchical framing from the perspective of the therapist, that unconditional positive regard, but focusing on it, sticking with it. And then progressively what happens is that the client is able to find a way to make it fit. So it's a way of building functional coherence, as we say it in the clinical RFT. And I just find that it does it really, really well. You would have asked me 10 years ago, or now maybe a little more, I would not have seen that in Carl Rogers. I would probably have criticized the lack of technical analysis, probably technical intention, more at the level of like precision of principles and where are you doing that. And I would have thought that what he was doing was too vague, too broad, like that stance. Okay, it's wonderful, but I would have missed how precise actually his work was. And I know that he used to watch videos or listen to tapes very carefully and note what was happening. And so it was actually, I don't know what you would have thought of clinical RFT, but I certainly see a lot of overlap in the spirit and but also in the way it's applied.
Yeah, so like he pay a lot of attention focusing on the words and the language at the time, listening tapes and Yeah.
He might not have like as much the concept of intervention, changing, activating change. That's something that comes more from my background in behavioral psychology. You know, going back to your first question, you know, when I started studying psychology in France, the dominant model is psychoanalysis, and very traditional psychoanalysis, not psychodynamic therapy with where it can be pretty interactive. Really, I mean, not that it's the only thing, but the dominant model is traditional psychoanalysis. And I did not like that at that time because that didn't feel functional enough, concrete, and not rational enough, too dogmatic, especially the way it was taught at university. Freud said that, Lacan said that, and I found that my teachers were not very open to discussion, criticism. To me, that's the sign that the model is so dominant that people don't even bother justifying themselves. So I was much more attracted to science, experimental research, because I've always, I guess, questioned what people say, rules, and
Yeah,
I
so
don't like
evidence-based,
dogmas.
like it's a questioning, not proving, but always questioning, like in the physics, as you said before, like we don't search, like the biggest proof of something is
the final proof, evidence that then is going to allow you to say the same thing forever, because that can happen in science too. I see it these days. I observe that at my level, and perhaps in part influenced by where I teach now for the past few years at Bastille University, which is originally it's a naturopathic school of medicine that was created about 40 years ago. And the idea was to approach scientifically medicine that was not traditional. So it was interesting because it was not just alternative medicine. It was still trying to be scientific, but about approaches that were not traditional. Also, our department of psychology and counseling is more traditional inside the school because everybody comes from, I think, traditional programs, evidence-based and all. But because we are where we are, we have a program that's much more holistic, humanistic, and also the students that I have often come from backgrounds, especially on the West Coast here, and all this, where people, you know, like they don't mind at all mixing tradition, spirituality, religions, things like that. And at first, I felt a bit like, okay, I'm on a mission here to bring more science and all. But over time, I probably life experiences too and things like that. But I started to be more critical, or at least to begin to see more how science can become dogmatic too. And the way my students would respond, question, and so the presentation they would make, I started to see that the thing that had made me attracted to scientific psychology, so fighting the dogma of psychoanalysis, some could be applied to what I was doing too, actually. And so in a way,
opposite, like
I think that's also why more recently I've gone back to philosophy more and the foundation of behaviorism, functional contextualism, because in the end that's what you need to have very strong to not fall in the traps of dogmatism. Is when going back to ACT, it's the whole idea of insensitivity to your experience. You follow your beliefs, and maybe you had a great belief at first because it came from your experience, like I succeeded today at work, so I did a good job, so I'm a good worker, you know. But then it can become a dogma, you know. I'm a good worker, you cannot tell me, you cannot give me bad feedback, who are you? And that's what's starting to become too rigid. So science can be like that too. You can have a fact that comes from the lab, from research, very solid. But if you start to rigidify it too much, you forget that it's a process. What you know today could change tomorrow.
So I had a very similar experience with, like, I also liked on the beginning CBT because it was for me here in Poland also like very concrete approach that you have a disorder, that this is something that it's been studied, and yeah, it like for me and maybe for my personality, I like to have everything like in the right order. But after years and years, I find out that the comorbidity and like that also the seeing a disorder is not to seeing a human, and that it makes me that I turned to the act, and for me on the beginning also it was hard because it was such a different approach that you do not on the beginning what the disorder it is. You don't search a diagnosis, but you do behavioral analysis. But after it, I find out that this is what I really like to do. And like you said, that of course, like when you work in a hospital, you cannot say, oh, this patient has like experiential avoidance or something. You have to do a diagnosis, but you still, when you work in the ACT way, that you still have a connection to a human being that is the same human being as you are, and you like. I that's my experience with ACT, and with a like very rigid approach that's been on the beginning for me, the CBT.
I think was it's this process of or categorization, conceptualization. We should not fear it, fight it, because that's what we do as humans with language. If we were not doing that, it's hard to even imagine what it would be like, because we often think, that way we would not be so miserable when we think we cannot be in a group or in another group. We would not judge. Yeah, we think only of those parts. But if you remove categorization, if you get out of your mind, you don't get into your life. You get into nothing at all. There is no spirituality. There is no poetry. There is no arts. There is no symbolism. There is no meaning. So you got to be careful with this sketchy way of thinking, or these criticisms that are true to some extent, but not completely, because then, like I said earlier, is that we start to create incoherence, contradictions in our understanding. And we start to say, oh yeah, it's bad to do this. We should not overthink it. We should not think of future, past. But first of all, who does that? Nobody. And second of all, who wants to do that in a reality? I mean, for truth. Nobody either. Who wants to not be able to think of a sweet memory with their kids last summer? Who wants to not think of the trip that they are going to do in a few weeks on vacation, and they're looking forward to planning? No, that's part of it. So then it's like, oh yeah, but that's fine. That's okay. Well, okay, but then what is it? It's present moment the problem? Is it the future? No, it's how you do that, how you integrate that. Everything there. And the problem of categories, like you said, it's like, well, for example, you cannot use experiential avoidance at the hospital because they want to serve different system. I've seen that. I supervise a lot of people around the world who tell me the same things. Can I write my notes in ACT language, RFT language when I'm asked to do this and that? I think a big part of it with RFT is that you think more broadly, more integratively than what other people do often. Like the number of times I've talked to people who were from different approaches, but I'm actually more in agreement with them than they are with me sometimes, because I see where they're going. Another way of saying it is that when you learn clinical RFT, you're going to see more potential. You're going to have more potential. But do you hear that noise from outside? Is a machine? If it's not, it's okay. You can still hear me. It probably shouldn't last too much. So if you know clinical RFT, the more you know clinical RFT, the more your universe is going to expand. Because it's not just the connections; it's how you can integrate all these connections. And by the way, that's exactly what we're trying to do with clients: is that they can see themselves as whole. They can integrate everything. Again, self as context, Rogers, and all, the same idea. Usually it's not the other way around. I almost never find that there are certain things that I cannot do with clinical RFT. Restrictions. No, as long as the function is toward integration, then you can be silent, you can be challenging, you can share your perspective, you can do self-disclosure, you can not do self-disclosure, you can do everything, even the rules that come from an institution, like you said, if the hospital say, or the ethics, the laws. Yeah, of course, in a way I could say, well, let's not even bother think about it, because you have to, it's legal, so just do it. But I think it's worth, and I try to do it when I talk about ethics with my students, is that don't just follow the rule, because first of all, the rules are not necessarily that clear. There's a lot of gray areas, so it's tricky. You could just do what you're told to do, of course. Say, hey, I have the right to do this. No, yes, okay. But if you want to enjoy your work more, if you want to do a better job, try to really connect what you do with the overall purpose. Understand the ethics. A lot of people have been thinking about it before you are playing it, and they are kind of similar across countries, more or less. There's got to be a reason, people are not just arbitrary controllers. So why, for example, you cannot share certain personal private information about yourself to a client or things like that? Well, why? Let's really think of why, the purpose functionally. Then once that makes sense, you actually do it much more naturally. You don't have to worry that much about it. And you can see the ways in which that would be fine and the ways in which that would not be fine. Not saying it's always easy, but it will help you. And to me, it's the same thing with using the language of an institution, like the DSM categories. Yeah. I don't really have any problem with using these terms. Because for me, it translates into what people are doing, experiencing, just like with you saying with schema therapy, you can. Now it's a way of thinking can shape your way of feeling and being. It's like when you switch language, like think in English or in French, but not completely, not far from completely. There are nuances. And yeah, the more I use disorder, the more I will think of my client as wrong, doing something problematic. I think that's true. I try to avoid the term disorder. I try to focus more on what people are doing, but the culture is still pretty strong in the psychotherapy, psychiatry world. And yeah, I think it's something to be aware of. But it's also useful to some extent, right?
Yeah, great. Okay, so I don't want to hold you too long.
I can always go on and on and on. So wherever you want to stop, I don't know if you want a conclusion question or something like that.
Yeah, maybe you have something like a message from your experience, like to the therapists, like what maybe in Poland, but in general, like what it would be.
Well, if the message was focused on RFT, I would say, well, if you've never heard of RFT, I would say if you're a therapist, you are using language in some ways. If you have already have a model, a way of thinking about language and all, and that works well for you, perhaps you're curious to see what we can do with RFT, but maybe you're fine with what you have. If you've never thought of it that way, I would really strongly encourage you to look at it, because it's not going to take anything away from what you're doing. Like I said, I think most of the time people who come to clinical RFT realize that eventually that there are a lot of things that they thought they could not do that they actually can do. And that's true even from people who do ACT therapy, and they often come to my trainings because of course the connection with RFT, I would like to know RFT better, to be a better ACT therapist, or just that's part of the things I'd like to learn at some point. And often they're like, oh, okay, so I can do actually more psychoeducation. Oh, actually, I can do cognitive restructuring. Oh, I can be more didactic, or there are lots of things like that, ideas that people develop over time, or present moment again, that with clinical RFT, they start to see there's more freedom, more coherence. Things start to come together, and then the potential becomes really big, because it's almost like I'm saying, so now you have really much more the possibility of doing it your way. And that, again, that's how I end up connecting again with Rogers, because it's really about, can you express yourself really authentically as a therapist? If you have to follow rules that other people have developed for you, and it feels like too much like, well, there are things that I can do, things that I cannot do, what is really act and all that. It's hard to be completely yourself. You may do great acts or the therapy, but there are still a piece missing. It's that more spontaneity, authenticity that comes from you, with that feeling of freedom, not freedom from any restriction, like I say, ethics and all. But the thing is, if you understand the ethics, actually you're free, because I would not want to harm my client. I would not want to do that. So because you understand the whole picture, you actually end up doing the right thing and feeling free. So that would be my message, is that I don't think that you have to know RFT. It's very important to RFT. It's the only way but I think RFT has really something interesting to offer to clinicians, and whether it's the approach that I developed in the book with Steve and Jen, and or other people have been doing things that some are very similar because they were developed before together. We exchange a lot, like Niklas Tornicki, Fran Ruiz, Yvonne Barnes-Holmes, Carmen Luciano, Louise McHugh. That's top that I can think of just right now. But then there are people also working with them around, especially on the clinical application in therapy. I think it's a really great way of, in the end, it's like you're going to be able to really own your approach to psychotherapy. In the end, you will say, well, that's my way of doing therapy, right? It's you can be inspired and learn from a lot of people, but then there will be only you doing therapy that way. It's not even like I'm doing ACT that way. I'm doing it, and it's like it's not even named a model. That's how I do therapy, and it's still evidence based. It's still sound, and it still makes sense and all.
We can be like we can be too rigid, also to be too flexible. Like you said that, like I cannot do the cognitive restructurization because it's bad. I think that it's very valuable. What you said.
Because you're right. You can also be too flexible in the sense of disorganized, not coherent enough. That's the problem of eclecticism. When people have a lot of tools in the box, but then the coherence across can be lost. If it's with one client, if you do a bit of cognitive restructuring and the goal is to change the thought, but then you also do some diffusion with ACT so that you let go of it. It's not impossible if you have a good framework to make sense of the use of both. I can do that. But if you're switching completely to a paradigm and then to another model, that is a problem. Because on one hand, you say you cannot change your thoughts, and then on the other hand, you say you can change your thoughts. And you're going to have to make sense of that. So that would be, it's not even flexible. It's, but I see what you mean. It's too much. It would be a freedom without any form of coherence and organization. And that's, in the end, that's it can happen to me, even teaching and all. When you follow an idea, sometimes it can even be coherent for you because it makes sense to you. You're a therapist, you know where you're going, but you have to always remember that there's a client or there are students, and are they also connected to that, right? So it's more likely to happen, this kind of getting lost, if you don't have a good solid framework to bring everything together. And I think RFT has both pretty well.
Hey, so thank you very much, Matthieu. It was a big pleasure, and I'm talking it not on the autopilot, but with the awareness that it was a great to do this interview. Thank you very much, and
great pleasure.
See you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'll stop the recording.
Yeah.